There's a moment at the end of the year when something uncomfortable happens. You start reviewing the entire year, what you did, what you didn't do, the expectations you built for the next one. You think about what never got finished, what was missing, the inevitable end of year gatherings, and you notice that certain anxieties have returned, the same ones. This particular kind of sadness doesn't come from a recent event. It comes from accumulation, from what you accepted without much conviction, from what you kept pushing off with the promise that it would make sense later. You know, those things we ignore because they're uncomfortable. The problem is that later has arrived. The end of the year creates this friction because it marks a symbolic boundary. And boundaries reveal things. They show how much certain choices have aged, how some versions of you are still tied to old expectations. They expose an uneasy distance between who you've become and who you thought you'd be by now. This sadness isn't an emotional flaw. It's a psychological signal, a warning that something needs to be seen, not fixed in a rush, but understood honestly. End-of-year sadness is often treated as something circumstantial, almost decorative, something that shows up because the calendar changes, because the lights go down, because the noise fades. But that explanation is too comfortable, and precisely because of that, it's insufficient. What happens during this time isn't just a fleeting emotional state. It's a predictable, recurring psychological phenomenon deeply connected to how human beings build identity over time. The end of the year doesn't create the sadness, it reveals it. It brings to the surface something that's been quietly held together in silence. For most of the year, the human mind operates in continuity mode. One day blends into the next without major interruptions, creating the illusion of stability. The harder questions don't disappear, but they lose sharpness. They stay there, dissolved in the flow of time. The problem is that the end of the year interrupts that flow. It imposes a symbolic marker that forces the mind to reorganize its own narrative. And that's when the discomfort shows up. Psychology calls this temporal evaluation. Whenever a cycle closes, the brain tries to integrate past, present, and future into a coherent story. When that story doesn't hold together, an internal tension emerges that's hard to name. It's not pure regret, it's not clear frustration. It's a sense of narrative misalignment, as if life is happening but out of sync with what you recognize as true. This sadness appears because the end of the year forces a quiet question. Is all of this going somewhere? And that question is dangerous because it can't be answered with optimism alone. It demands structure, direction, meaning that isn't just emotional but existential. When that foundation isn't clear, the brain enters conflict. One part tries to maintain continuity. Another starts questioning the entire path. That's why so many people feel a specific kind of weight during this time, even when nothing external seems wrong. The suffering doesn't come from what's missing, but from the realization that time has moved too fast for certain unresolved things to keep being tolerated. The mind starts making comparisons, not with other people, but with earlier versions of itself. And those comparisons are rarely kind. There's also an important psychological factor that's almost never mentioned. The end of the year reduces the space for symbolic escape. The idea of later loses its power. The calendar no longer offers vague excuses. The near future moves closer with uncomfortable clarity. And when the future gets too close, it stops being a comforting abstraction and starts demanding an internal position. This sadness, then, isn't a sign of emotional weakness. It's a sign of emerging awareness, an indication that something inside you has noticed an inconsistency that can no longer be ignored. The problem is that without the right language, that awareness turns into nothing more than unease. This is where many people get lost. Instead of listening to what this feeling is pointing toward, they try to neutralize it, minimize it, cover it up, explain it away too quickly. But persistent feelings don't ask for anesthesia. They ask to be understood. The end of the year works like a psychological mirror that's more honest than we'd like. It doesn't show you who you should be. It shows you what's no longer working in the story you've been telling yourself. And until that story is carefully revisited, this sadness will keep coming back. Not because the year ends, but because something inside you is still waiting to be understood. When this sadness shows up, it's usually interpreted as a sign that something is missing. But that reading is superficial. What actually hurts isn't the absence of something new, it's the friction between who you've become and the identity you learn to maintain. There comes a moment when a person realizes they're living in a way that aligns with expectations they no longer recognize as their own. Not because anyone forced them to, but because at some point it was easier to keep going than to stop. Adult identity is built far more through accumulation than through conscious choice. And the problem with accumulation is that it never asks whether it still makes sense. Psychology understands identity as an internal narrative that's stable enough to give continuity to experience. When that narrative starts to fail, the person doesn't immediately fall into crisis. They fall into inadequacy, a diffuse feeling of being out of place inside their own life. Nothing seems explicitly wrong, but nothing fits quite right either. This sense of inadequacy becomes especially intense at the end of the year because time stops being abstract. The calendar makes its passage concrete. What once felt like a process in motion starts to feel like a fixed structure, and fixed structures reveal incompatibilities more clearly than open processes do. The discomfort grows because the identity you present to the world keeps working, while the identity you feel on the inside starts to lose traction. You recognize yourself in the words you use to describe who you are, but not in the sensations those words are supposed to support. It's like repeating a name that still sounds familiar, but no longer responds when called. This kind of sadness doesn't come from failure, it comes from clarity. From realizing that living in an acceptable way doesn't guarantee inner belonging. And belonging in this sense has nothing to do with groups or external validation. It has to do with inhabiting your own life without constantly having to justify it. What makes this process even harder is the fear of admitting inadequacy, because admitting it feels like ingratitude, like a confession of incapacity, like a lack of maturity. So the person tries to reframe the feeling into something more acceptable. They call it exhaustion, they call it a phase, they call it overthinking, but the feeling doesn't dissolve because it isn't a misinterpretation. It's a signal of misalignment. The human mind deeply resists the idea that it may have invested too much time in a version of itself that no longer fits. That's why the sadness becomes persistent, not as punishment, but as insistence. Something inside you keeps pressing the same point because it knows that ignoring this discrepancy comes with a psychological cost that's too high. The end of the year intensifies this process because it limits narrative escape routes. The story of "I'm on the right path" loses strength when the path starts to feel circular. The promise that everything will make sense later weakens when later begins to repeat itself. This sadness doesn't ask for an immediate decision. It asks for honesty. It asks you to acknowledge that you may be living by criteria that haven't been revisited in a long time, that you may be sustaining an identity that worked for a while, but now requires too much effort to remain livable. The problem isn't changing who you are. The problem is insisting on being someone you can no longer support from the inside. And until that gap is recognized, the end of every year will keep bringing the same discomfort. Not as coincidence, but as a direct psychological consequence of an identity that needs to be rethought. Before we continue, here's a simple request. If this video has stayed with you this far, like it and subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a formality, it's a way of saying that this kind of conversation, more honest, less rushed, resonates with you, and it helps keep this space alive. Now let's move forward. When end-of-year sadness becomes conscious, many people feel a strange urgency to fix what they're feeling, as if they need to reach a quick conclusion, make a clear decision, reorganize everything all at once. That urgency usually comes from discomfort, not clarity, and it rarely helps. There's a more useful and paradoxically simpler approach, learning to observe what this feeling is trying to protect, because contrary to how it seems, it doesn't show up to sabotage you, it shows up to prevent something worse. In practice, this sadness often appears when a person realizes they're living by criteria that haven't been updated over time. Old standards are still being used to evaluate a life that has already changed. The problem isn't the life itself, it's the ruler being used to measure it. A simple and deeply revealing exercise is to pay attention to the internal sentences that surface at this time of year. Not the optimistic ones, and not the ones you'd say out loud, but the ones that appear when no one is listening. Phrases like, "I was supposed to be somewhere else by now. This isn't quite what I imagined," or "I can't explain it, but something feels off." These aren't empty complaints, they're indicators. Another important thing to notice is where you've been over-explaining yourself. When a life makes sense internally, it requires very few justifications. When it doesn't, people start rationalizing excessively, explaining why they chose this, why they accepted that, why now isn't the right time. Constant rationalization is often a sign that intuition isn't being heard. None of this means you need to change everything or make drastic decisions. What this moment calls for is something more subtle, internal alignment. And alignment starts with small adjustments in honesty, not with big external moves. One helpful shift is replacing the question, "What should I do?" with "What have I been avoiding acknowledging?" The first creates anxiety, the second creates clarity, because more often than not, suffering doesn't come from a lack of options, it comes from refusing to name what's already obvious on the inside. It also helps to notice how you react to the idea of the coming year, not the plans themselves, but the sensations they trigger. If thinking about the near future feels heavy, the problem may not be the future, it may be how the present is being held together. This process requires gentleness, because looking directly at what doesn't fit is uncomfortable, but it's also deeply freeing. End-of-year sadness begins to lose its grip when it's no longer treated as an emotional flaw and instead seen as a signal that adjustment is needed. You don't have to turn this feeling into enthusiasm or motivation. You just have to turn it into information. When that happens, something shifts. The sadness stops being a vague weight and starts organizing itself into understanding. And understanding, even when it doesn't bring immediate answers, is already a major step forward, because it restores the sense that you're finally in dialogue with yourself instead of just reacting to time as it passes. There's a delicate point in this process that's almost never talked about. End of year sadness doesn't hurt only because of what's missing, but because of what needs to be left behind. And leaving something behind doesn't mean abandoning concrete things. It means letting go of internal narratives that for a long time gave you a sense of safety. Everyone builds stories about themselves in order to keep moving forward. Stories about who they are, where they're going, what makes sense to endure now in order to reap rewards later. These stories aren't lies, they're temporary structures. The problem begins when they age but continue to be treated as permanent truths. The end of the year tends to expose this wear and tear, not because it demands immediate decisions, but because it highlights how certain stories no longer explain your lived experience. What once felt coherent starts to feel forced. What once supported you starts to feel heavy. This is an especially sensitive moment because it touches deep identity. Acknowledging that an internal narrative has lost its validity can trigger fear of wasted time, fear of admitting that certain choices didn't lead exactly where you thought they would, fear of not knowing which story to tell in place of the old one. That's why many people try to reinforce the old narrative instead of revisiting it. They convince themselves it's just a phase, that everything will sort itself out, that they just need to get through one more cycle. But the discomfort persists because this isn't about patience, it's about internal coherence. There's an important psychological aspect here. The human mind prefers an imperfect explanation to no explanation at all. Even if a story no longer works well, it still offers predictability. Letting it go means entering uncertainty. And uncertainty, while necessary, is frightening. End-of-year sadness intensifies precisely at this point of transition. It shows up when the old narrative no longer holds, but the new one hasn't been formed yet. It's an in-between space, a psychological interval. Uncomfortable, but fertile. The common mistake is trying to fill this space too quickly. Forcing conclusions, creating rushed new stories, making grand promises to yourself just to relieve the immediate discomfort. But new stories need time to be born. They require observation, listening, and a willingness not to know, at least for a while. This period calls for fewer answers and more presence, less urgency to define, more care in noticing. What exactly has stopped making sense? In which moments do you feel like you're playing a role? Where do you feel most distant from yourself? These questions don't demand immediate action, they ask for sustained honesty. There's something deeply human about moving through this kind of sadness. It's not a sign of personal failure, it's a sign that consciousness is trying to reorganize itself, that something inside you is asking for a more aligned life, not necessarily a more impressive one. When that request is heard, even without clear answers, something begins to settle. The sadness stops being a constant weight and becomes a temporary state, not because it's been fixed, but because it's been acknowledged. The end of the year doesn't have to become a ritual of forced optimism or an internal courtroom. It can be seen as a space for honest review, a moment where you allow old stories to end without immediately replacing them. At that point, the question shifts from why does this hurt to something more subtle and more powerful. What changes when you stop fighting this feeling and start listening to it with more courage? That's where something truly begins to reorganize. A sense of relief begins to emerge when sadness stops being treated as a problem to eliminate and starts being understood as a form of emotional intelligence. Not because it offers ready-made answers, but because it changes the quality of the questions. And better questions transform the way you relate to your own life. When you stop fighting this feeling, something important happens. The urgency fades. The need to fix everything right now loses its grip. In its place, something rarer appears. A willingness to stay attentive. Attentive to what feels meaningful. Attentive to what feels heavy. Attentive to what no longer asks for continuation, even if there's nothing clear to replace it yet. Hope, in this context, isn't about imagining an ideal future. It's about recovering a sense of inner dialogue, about realizing you're not broken for feeling this way, that you're not behind for lacking immediate clarity, that you're not failing because you need to reassess your path. Many people associate hope with certainty, but in adult life, hope often comes from somewhere else, from allowing yourself not to know everything right now without turning that uncertainty into despair, from trusting that clarity doesn't come from rushing, but from sustained attention. The end of the year can be an especially powerful moment for this kind of inner reconciliation. Not because it neatly wraps things up, but because it creates a symbolic pause, a chance to lower the noise and listen more carefully to what's been ignored, not to act immediately, but to acknowledge that some expectations need revisiting, to acknowledge that some comparisons can be let go, to acknowledge that living honestly sometimes requires moving through periods of uncertainty. This doesn't mean giving up on growth, change, or building something new. It means choosing a form of growth that's less violent toward yourself, a movement that respects the psychological timing of real transformation. End of year sadness begins to change when you realize it isn't trying to pull you backward, but inviting you to move forward differently. No longer supported only by old explanations, but by more refined listening to who you've become. Maybe the new year doesn't need to begin with grand promises. Maybe it can begin with something simpler and stronger. A more honest relationship with what you feel when no one is watching, with what you notice when the noise quiets down, with what keeps surfacing, even when you try to ignore it. Hope here is this: trusting that you can move through this moment without emotionally harming yourself, that you can allow new stories to form without demanding they be complete right now, that you can keep going without abandoning yourself in the process. If this video did anything, let it be this: a reminder that feeling sadness at this time of year doesn't separate you from life. On the contrary, it may be exactly what reconnects you to it in a more honest way. And maybe that's a good place to begin.